Hello and welcome to a special discussion on the Union Budget, which was presented by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman this morning in Parliament. We are coming to you live from the Hindustan Times newsroom in New Delhi. To discuss the budget, its underlying philosophy, and the various proposals presented by the Finance Minister, I am joined by a very distinguished panel. Mr. R. Sukumar, the Editor-in-Chief of Hindustan Times, Roshan Kishore, the Political Economy and Data Editor of Hindustan Times, and Himanshu of Jawaharlal Nehru University, who is also a columnist with Mint and one of the most outstanding economists of his generation. Let me begin with you, Sukumar sir. You have just come back after interviewing Finance Minister Sitharaman. What is your reading of the philosophy that has driven this budget? And do you think it's adequate to tackle the economic slowdown that India finds itself in?
See, I'll answer the second question first. I don't think it's adequate to tackle the economic slowdown. That is the simple answer. Some time back, I wrote an edit where I said we need to throw the kitchen sink at the problem because it is a fundamental problem. And I think many analysts were at that point in time were still debating whether it was cyclical or structural or anything else. I think it's everything, including behavioral. And I think you need to do a lot more. Have they tried? I think they've tried. And I think there are one or two things that the finance minister and the government clearly seem to be betting on. And the first one is the fact that the tax cut that they've put in place, because it is a cut in some ways for some salaried or non-salaried, some taxpayers. The estimates vary, right? I mean, according to the government's own calculations, 40,000 crore revenue foregone. I've already seen a few analyst reports which put the number between 10,000 and 25,000 crore. Whatever it is significant. And I think that money the government is hoping will go into consumption, savings, whatever else, but is hoping that it increases discretionary income, makes them feel good. So it is something that addresses the problem of consumption, because aggregate demand is one of the problems that the economy is facing right now. I don't see anything similar that has happened on the rural side, right? I mean, so yes, more could have been done. The second thing that the government seems to be betting on is clearly the fact that a lot of the funding for infra projects will probably come from the market. And when I say the market, I don't mean specifically the market, but I also mean things like sovereign wealth funds, for whom the investment in infrastructure has actually been made reasonably attractive. As long as there is a certain lock-in period, and I think the investment is in infrastructure per se and not in hot money. They are happy to. I think there's no tax on dividends. I think there's no capital gains tax. So it's pretty attractive for sovereign wealth funds. Now the question is, do you have enough of an attractive environment to get these people to come in and make those investments? Because if you look at a 6-month period starting, let's say, September, and you look at all the things that the government has done, there have been a lot of measures that have been announced. Some of them have still not kicked in. And one of those things was the announcement of a National Infrastructure Pipeline, or NIP, which she spoke about. And if you look at it, I think one of the interesting themes of the budget is she specifically mentioned, and I don't remember the last time when there was such a specific mention, that the divestment proceeds would directly go to funding two infrastructure companies that the government has set up, so that the money goes into infrastructure and not just balancing the deficit. Because typically that's what we all critique the process for, right? That the money goes and it is used to fund the deficit. Whereas here the money is going, and it is going into two infrastructure companies that have been set up, already been set up, they're existing, and will be put to good productive use to actually create assets and will not go to fund interest payments.
So, Himanshu, I'd like to come to you. Taxes and infra are one side of the story. But the other big bet that the government seems to have taken, which maybe is not adequate, is rural. And the finance minister presented a 16-point roadmap. We know that farmers have been in distress. We know that rural demand is slumped, which is one of the causes for the slowdown. Do you think the 16-point roadmap for agriculture and the rural economy is enough? And what are the broad contours of it? And where is it lacking?
I mean, I think some of the facts are very clear. They're on the table that we are going through a very serious demand slump in the rural areas. And that's something which is pretty obvious. And there is also a consensus that the only way you can basically lead to revival of the economic growth is if you're spending enough money, and that has to come from the government in the rural economy. Agriculture is one part of it, not the only part of it, and agriculture has been in crisis for the last 2 to 3 years. That is also more or less known now, and the story is pretty obvious in that sense. Now, if you look at the 16 point, and if you break it down, there is nothing which is a new expenditure in that sense. And you can make announcements in that sense. And really the budget is about expenditure and revenues. And the expenditure story is very much clear compared to the budget announcement last year. This year's budget, the revised estimates which have been presented for last year, there is a 30,000 crore rupees shortfall. In the sense there is underspending. So you, on one hand you are underspending. On the second hand you are basically saying that I'm going to have a spending which is almost the same as the previous year. So one has to not just look at the numbers in the budget, but also the whether you actually mean what you say. And this is something which is true for not just the agricultural sector, it is also true for the food subsidy, it is also true for various other expenditures which directly or indirectly go to the rural areas. I think the second part which is something which is very important and related to the rural economy again, is, and we have been talking about, most people have been talking about, that there is a limited amount of money that you can spend in agriculture. Partly because the avenues are limited, states spend a large part of that amount of money. Except for the fact this PM Kisan, which has been 75,000 crores, which has bumped up the total budgetary allocation. And that also, by the way, they have not spent. In the sense, only 50,000 crores have been spent on that particular program. The non-agricultural part, particularly the rural infrastructure part, required a pump. In a sense, some kind of a money was to be pumped in those programs. But again, if you look at those numbers, there is a sharp cutback on those expenditures last year. And even the current expenditures which have been budgeted in the budget for 2020-21, these are either the same or in some senses lower than what was budgeted in the earlier one. The big one, for example, which everybody talks about, PMGSY, 5,000 crore is the underspending. Now, that is a time when you have a rural crisis, and the non-agriculture sector is in a crisis, when wages have slowed down, when agriculture is not doing well. I would say that it's, to the extent it is criminal, in the sense you are really making sure that the rural economy does not revive even after the budget that you have presented. So I think the 16 points, various infrastructure things that we're talking about, none of them are new, and most of them have been renamed in that sense. But if you look at the allocations on those, then that is not matched by the announcement that have been made in either of these. And there is, so I don't understand what do we make sense of these 16 announcements. You can make 16, 20, 30 announcements, but as long as you don't put your money where your mouth is, then I don't think it makes any sense for you to discuss on what exactly do they mean for agricultural revival.
So you're suggesting that the expenditure has either remained flat or has dropped?
No, the budgeted expenditure has remained the same, in the sense the budget for the last year was 150,000 crores in agriculture. This year again it's 150,000, roughly around that. But the actual spending last year, this particular year, 1920, it was only 120,000 crores. So 30,000 crore is what you've not spent, given the promise that you've made that you are going to spend on that much. So I think, I'm not sure what to make sense of this, the whole thing, that this year you're saying that I'm going to have the same amount as the previous year. If you're not going to end up, and I can be sure for this, given the revenue projections that they have, receipts projections that they have, that they're not able to go, they will not be able to spend 150,000 crores that they have budgeted. That has been the trend for the last 3 years. Investment in agriculture has gone down, the spending has gone down, and this is something which is very, very clear for the last 3 budgets. So I'm not surprised if something which is budgeted in this year is not going to materialize in the next year.
Roshan, let me get you in here. One of the big numbers that everybody was waiting for was the fiscal deficit. And we had argued in Hindustan Times editorially that the government should be open to breaching the fiscal deficit threshold. That is what the government has done. How do you read the way the government approached the fisc this year?
See, there is a 50 basis point slippage in the fiscal deficit. It has gone to 3.8 from 3.3. But like what Himanshu said, this deficit is not only because just revenues have fallen. This deficit has been managed by also unleashing a sharp cut in expenditure of the government. So basically, and the next year's fiscal deficit, which is supposed to come back to 3.3, it is based on very rosy projections of non-tax revenues. They are planning to divest LIC, etc. Divestment proceeds have gone to around 2 lakh crore rupees. So The government on paper is saying that it is committed to maintaining the fiscal glide path, but I think the basic thing is, and I would like to link it to the question on the economic philosophy of the budget which you asked. I think this government's economic philosophy has been pretty consistent. It sees the formal sector as the main driver of the Indian economy as we go in the future. And it sees the informal sector as some sort of a dead weight which ought to be punished, disciplined, things such as demonetization, GST, etc., where policies in that regard. And which is where the basic problem lies. As we've seen, even the 2018-19 GDP numbers have been revised downward from 6.8 to 6.1. In agriculture, there's a sharp downward revision of 2.5 to 1% growth. So basically, a lot of economists, and I subscribe to that view, have been arguing that the current slowdown has its roots in the informal economy. And the government's measures in this budget, cut in corporate tax rates, because between these budgets there was a huge cut in corporate tax rate, which is much bigger than the income tax rates which have been cut this time. Now an exemption, a cutback in income tax rates. It believes that the economy can be revived by giving incentives to the formal sector. There, I think there's a fundamental problem in this government's philosophy. It is not willing or even willing to acknowledge the problems in the informal sector, and it continues to believe that we can revive the economy through the formal way, which unfortunately, as experience has taught us, is not going to happen.
As a matter of objective, that's laudable, right? That you try to modernize the economy, you try to formalize the economy. Do you think the problem was that they didn't plan the transition well enough, or they hurried too much into it?
No, a big and diverse economy as India will not lend itself to, policy aspirations of the government of the day. So if you have to modernize the Indian economy, a lot of economies, even the Chinese economy was not very modern a couple of decades ago. But there is a certain path towards that. You can't do it by force, and you can't do it by sort of putting a squeeze on the informal sector. This is something I don't think this government realizes, because let us remember, let us go back. Now we have the GDP numbers. Even after the economic crisis, even after 2012-13, when the corporate sector, when the formal sector was in a lot of stress, there was bad debt building up, etc. But economic growth did not fall down to these levels. This is because the informal sector of the economy, which was not intrinsically sort of connected to the formal sector, was still running. It kept the formal sector going. The government is looking at the tip of the iceberg and trying to diagnose the economic problem, whereas the part of the iceberg which is underwater is the informal economy. Unless you acknowledge that, there's a problem.
So, Vasa, let me get back to a point that you made, which was about taxes. That's something that our viewers would be deeply interested in. The government last year increased the exemption to 5 lakhs. So those who earn up to 5 lakhs don't have to pay tax now. And today they have rationalized taxes from 5 lakhs to 15 lakhs, right? Do you think this does have the impact of enhancing the disposable income in the hands of a large segment of taxpayers, and it's a prudent move and is in tune with rationalizing tax regimes, or do you think this was not the moment to do it?
No, I think this is it's a good move, but in part. And in the course of our discussion with the finance minister now, I think she's very clearly mentioned. She very clearly mentioned that the exemptions will eventually go, and as long as you have that clarity of thought, I don't think there is anyone who can argue with fewer tax slabs, lower taxes, and no exemptions. And of course, we have another big problem when it comes to income tax, which is really compliance and widening the tax net, which is a real issue. Everyone in India is taxed, right? Because everyone pays indirect tax. But direct tax payment, there is significant slippage outside the net. And how do you do this without harassing existing taxpayers? Which is, I think, where the charter will come in, because the income tax charter that she announced is fairly significant from that perspective. There are very few countries that have it. But I think this move, to answer your question, will put some money in the hands of people. Could result in some upward blip, move up in savings, a spike in savings, a spike in consumption to some extent. It will make the salaried person feel good. It does not simplify the regime. In fact, at each level now you have two options, right? So in effect you have exactly, you have a far more complex structure. The fine print needs to be seen. There is also some talk of some of the exemptions having been removed. There are around 100 to 120 exemptions, and I think they've removed 70 of them. You'll have to see which exemptions have been removed and which ones have been retained. But in principle, lowering tax rates, reducing the number of exemptions, removing some of the exemptions altogether are all very, very progressive steps. It's something that we have to work towards. I would just want to weigh in a little bit on what Roshan said. I don't think you can do an either-or kind of thing, right? It is a fact that we have forcibly formalized an economy of significant size and diversity. And the Indian economy is extremely diverse and very, very complex, and this is large, right? I mean, it's a $2.7 trillion economy, so it is not a small economy. So you have forcibly formalized, and no economy of this size has been successfully formalized through force. So to have sudden shocks that cause that will immediately result in a negative force being applied on economic activity, which you're seeing. But it is not the only factor that is contributed. Like I said at the beginning, there are structural factors, there are cyclical factors, there are behavioral factors, there are all kinds of changes that have happened. So I think you have to address this in every dimension. And I think that is a very complex process. I'm not sure that this budget does that. I'm not sure any budget will be able to do that. You can only aspire to do that. But what you should do is to have a policy regime which, through the budget and through everything else that you're doing, seeks to address that entire thing. Part of it is rural, where I would tend to agree with what Himanshu has said. I don't think there is enough being done for rural. I don't see too much being done for agriculture. I think we really need to focus on the agrarian crisis that has been going on in this country for how long now?
At least 5 years.
At least 5 years, and which is resulting in significant social and political churn. Right? I mean, much of it stems from economic factors, and it requires a fundamental rethink of how we approach the agrarian economy. And because you just have to look at the big numbers to realize that it doesn't work out. 15 to 16% of the GDP. How much of the manpower is employed in it? 40% of the manpower employed in it. Just doesn't add up. You look at average land holding size, the problem becomes even more acute. Then you look at the fact that many of the people who are actually working don't even produce for the market, produce for themselves. So it's very, very complex, and you need to address that. I don't think we have had industry in this country is in many ways fortunate, because there have been one or two moments of very clear thinking, progressive steps that have been taken when it comes to industry. I don't know enough about agriculture to say this, but I have not seen similar moves being made for agriculture, and you probably need one of those. You need a new deal.
Let me take a cue from that. This is a government that has a massive majority. Prime Minister Narendra Modi remains very popular despite some state level electoral setbacks. Why is it that a government that is armed with such a legislative majority, why has it not shown the imagination and invested that political capital to embark on that new deal that Sukumar sir was talking about? What do you think is holding it back?
I mean, very difficult to, but I mean, one can make guesses as to what exactly is happening. I mean, one is simply the confidence that whatever you do, I mean, all of us in this room might think that demonetization was bad, but there are people who argue that it delivered them the UP government in a sense. Or for example, there was a massive agrarian crisis in October-November 2018 when they lost the state governments, but then came back. I mean, at a time when all the slowdown that we are talking about, the slowdown was very much visible there. But again, government came with an enhanced majority. So in a sense, probably the Prime Minister has the ability to transcend that economic narrative and create his own narrative. And that narrative remains powerful as ever. And that's why you see, I mean, whether currently the Delhi elections are going on, you don't see them going and campaigning on the economic issues. I mean, the campaign that is happening is on an entirely different issue on which they have full command. I mean, in a sense, they can set the narrative. So I think, in a sense, that confidence is also there. That may be overconfidence at some point of time, because, I mean, after all of these issues, the economic issues, slowly, maybe it will take some time, but do start hurting the political sentiments at some point of time. Maybe not now, maybe after 2 years, maybe 3 years. We don't know. I mean, it's very difficult to predict. But I also think that there is a general belief which is there And that general belief comes out from the various pronouncements that are made by the ministers, by himself, and otherwise by the economic survey. And if you look at the fine print in that sense, that fine print is very much clearly in favor of that investment is necessary. The corporate sector has to create wealth or to basically drive the economy. And that belief, I think, is coming from the very disposition that this party has, which is what you used to call at some point of time the traders party in that sense. But I think that narrative is very fine. That narrative is particularly, but the complexity that Sukumar was talking about or Roshan was talking about, that complexity is far more, in a sense, in the Indian context, is something that we have not been able to figure out. One of the things is that you might think that India, for example, the corporate or the formal sector is more or less dealing from the Bharat, which is the poor part of it. But that's not the case. Today, if you look at it, most of the people who are there in the corporate sector or who are there in the trade bodies would say that the rural demand injection in the rural economy is the key to India's survival. India cannot survive if the whole 50% of your economy or the 60% of your population is living in rural areas is going through a distress. So I think that kind of a linking is still something which is very much evident. Why on earth would the demand which is going down in the rural areas would impact the expenditures? But that's something which is very what we call as the Econ 101, the very, very primary understanding of economy, that the demand drives the kind of a behavior that you can see from that I think is something which they have not percolated down the thinking of this government. And that is still the belief that you see from the statement that comes from the Prime Minister or from the Finance Minister or from the various other people who are explaining the policies of the BJP government.
Roshan, I want to talk about unemployment. We have heard a predictable script over the past few decades from different governments. We need manufacturing. That's the way to generate mass-based employment. That's what China did. The government, when it came in 2014, launched Make in India with a lot of hype. It hasn't really delivered. Even today, we heard the Finance Minister talk about encouraging industry, ensuring that tax harassment does not happen, giving incentives. Why is the manufacturing story not picking up? Until it picks up, will India be able to address the unemployment question?
There are two issues, I think. One is a historical fact. I think historically, India has somehow missed the manufacturing bus when the South Asian countries succeeded, China succeeded. Now that the global economy is not growing, at the rates at which it was growing before the economic crisis hit. So there is definitely only so much demand to cater to, and a country like China, in certain sectors, even a country like Bangladesh, etc., have surged ahead for us. So like we have an advantage in, say, software, these countries have an advantage in manufacturing. That's their one that you have to live with. The other thing is, I think this initiatives such as Make in India, etc., are fine, and a push has to be there. You have to get iPhone to set up a factory in India if you can. You have to give them tax exemptions if you can. But the other thing also, I think, is this has to be seen in the wake of our failure to significantly enhance our human capital. Even if a country wanted to come and set up shop in India, a world-class manufacturing facility, where will it find the workforce? There are umpteen reports which say that, forget polytechnic and vocational training, etc. Even our engineering graduates, bulk of them are not employable. So unless we get our act together in our human capital thing also, I think to have very ambitious targets in manufacturing would be is not something which is practical. So any push towards getting the workforce into manufacturing or industry or high value services, etc., has to be accompanied by a push in this thing. So for example, for skill development, I think there's some 3,000, 4,000 crores which have been allocated. So education has definitely, it has to be given much more. Now today, because the context is such that we are talking about a stimulus in terms of, say, injecting rural demand, etc. But even in normal times, when the growth rates were not as low as they are today, I think there has always been a debate on whether a stimulus should be done just to give boost to our social spending, which is health and education. These are questions, hopefully, when growth revives, this government or the other governments will tackle.
Manufacturing is actually a very, very interesting thing because it's affected by a multitude of factors. One of these is, of course, what Roshan said, where human capital is a significant factor. Infrastructure is another factor, where as much as we build, there are countries which have built more, which have built better, which have built faster, and which have built cheaper. right? And better quality of infrastructure, which is very, very important. Logistics is another factor where, again, we've made progress, but we've not made as much progress of other countries. Even the kind of trade deals that we've struck over the last 15 years are problems because some of the FTAs that we have are downright unfair to or are a disincentive to companies to set up manufacturing bases in India simply because it might be cheaper. For instance, let's take auto components, to just make them in Thailand and ship them into India because India has an FTA. And it's not, so you probably have to see it in the broader context of all this. Human capital, of course, is a very, very significant reason. And like software, for instance, one of the reasons India had an edge was because of the privatization of technical education in this country in the 80s, I would think, 70s and 80s, late 70s and 80s. Some of the southern states and Maharashtra, I think, decided to privatize technical education, largely as an act of political patronage. I think the adventitious benefit was the mushrooming of colleges and lots of talent that went in, and so that when Y2K happened, India had that workforce which was capable of doing that, and since then the software industry has built upon it, largely because I think they had some very, very visionary leaders who knew what to do. The manufacturing, we have some really good companies in manufacturing, but I don't think some of the ingredients, human capital, logistics, infrastructure, the kind of trade deals we have with some neighboring countries and some countries in ASEAN, and some of those probably need revisiting.
Would it be fair to say then that the budget, not that the budget could have done everything, but the budget has not effected the kind of structural reforms which were necessary to push manufacturing? Yeah,
but budget can't institute those structural reforms. I mean, and I think it is unfair to. I don't think it is unfair. I think it's unfair to expect the budget to do that. Typically, the budget can play with tax. And I think it has played with tax, and then the budget can play with money. It can say, I'm going to spend more in this particular area, and for good or for bad, there are some areas where they've said they'll spend more, there are some areas where they'll spend less. Those are the kind of things that they can do, and broadly can give direction. But to affect the kind of structural reform that you actually need to do to, let's say, give a real boost to manufacturing.
Why have the markets reacted so negatively?
Markets are, see, I don't know. I mean, one of the typical reports that we used to commission every time was how the market behaves, and to see the correlation between whether it's a good budget or a bad budget. Markets are largely disconnected from the big picture, largely. Right? I mean, you see over the last 6 to 8 months, we've seen some horrible macro data come out, and yet we've seen the market continue to do very well. If the markets were so linked to fundamentals, then they should have reacted to adverse macroeconomic data, because at the end of the day, everyone is affected by what happens in the larger economy. That hasn't been the case. I would think that there are specific pain points that they've felt. One of it is the fear that of ATCC, that the reason why a lot of people invest in insurance policies is because there are some tax savings that's gone. One could be the dividend distribution tax, because now people have to pay it, companies don't have to pay it, but it increases the tax outgo of people. Previously, companies were paying it. So investor sentiment, therefore, might be going down, because for people, they now have to pay that money. So I think it's a multitude of small pain points. I can't explain why there has been such a huge fall in the market, but I also don't think we need to explain that. I think I saw some solid infrastructure stocks take a beating. I see nothing in the budget why they should have taken a beating, and these are blue chips. I have a feeling that on Monday they'll probably recover, but you can't hold me to this. It's entirely possible that they may not recover on Monday, because they move in their own orbit.
So no advice on whether people should invest on Monday morning or not?
No, I mean, investment logic is always the same. I mean, you have to invest for the very, very long term. You have to study fundamentals and invest for the long term. I don't think you can invest with a 2-week perspective, I mean a 2-week time horizon in mind.
A final set of questions. We know economic policy making is a continuous process, and budget is just one significant but one moment. What are the 3 things that you would like the government to do, Himanshu ji, for it to kickstart the economy?
I think you have to think about 3 things. I mean, the first thing is, which is the thing that the government should have done, which is something which everybody has been talking about, is to inject money in the rural economy. I mean, it's something which is, if you don't do it, I think you're running out of time. In a sense, some of the pressure points were, visible in 2016-17, 18-19, 19-20, and you've not been doing it. I mean, so that is why from 8.2, you have come down to 5. The 3 percentage point decline in just 3 years. That's a very sharp decline, even though there is no global catastrophe like or financial crisis or something like that has happened. So in a sense, that's something which is non-negotiable. I mean, it's something which was expected, something that should have been done in any particular
And your disappointment with the budget is that it does not do that.
Second, I think, is something which is the government has to be very, very, I mean, I would like to at least insist on this, that there is a lot of these numbers that are being thrown in, and every time in the budget you get to, I mean, I'll give you an example of this food subsidy thing, which is, I mean, in 16-17, the actual expenditure was 110,000 crores. 110,000 crores was the actual expenditure on food subsidy. In 17-18, they announced 140,000 crore rupees as the budget one. Actual expenditure goes to 100,000 crores. 18-19, they announced 170,000 crores, actual expenditure is 105,000 crores. Then you announce 190,000 crores, then actually it's 105. I mean, in a sense, the sanctity of the budget numbers have to be maintained. I mean, you can't be simply saying that I'm going to spend 150,000 crores or 190,000 crores, and at the end of it, you have 100,000 crores being spent. And in a sense, because people are making decisions based on this, and we are going to analyze it based on we're taking it on face value, but should not come to that situation where these numbers, and this is true for the receipt numbers, this is true for the expenditure numbers, this is true for the deficit numbers, and this is true for the overall, I mean, the whole perspective on data. I think that's something which the government should come out, not in the budget, but also otherwise, in a sense, should do it. And third, they will have to be very honest in terms of how to generate revenues, what kind of priorities they will have to make it very, very clear, give a correct signal to the investors, give a correct signal to the economy as such, not to the stock market, but generally in a sense, because this is a long-term process. Budget comes once in a year, but, and you know it very well, that what a large part of the budget is GST, I mean the indirect taxes, that is out of the ambit of the budget now. But you can't have 68 changes in budget, I mean the GST rates in just 2 years. I mean, that's like having a budget every week, kind of. You can't have that scheme also working. And you can't have some kind of taking a decision and then withdrawing it after 1 month and not following it up after some time. So in a sense, that policy stability or some kind of a framework, good or bad or whatever, is something that the government will have to make sure that it is available, that is clear, and that is something which is followed through the course of the year. I think the last two are more in terms of any government should be doing it. But as of now, the priority is to spend in the rural areas, and there is no two ways about it.
Roshan, same question. 3 things quickly what the government should do over the year.
See, as the economy has modernized and privatized, the share of the budget vis-a-vis the economy, the budgetary spending, it has actually been coming down. So, technically speaking, the importance of the budget is a lot less than what it used to be, say, a couple of decades ago or 3-4 decades ago. So the budget, yes, it is an exercise in accounting, but I think it is also an exercise of signaling of intent of the government. And given the fact that this government, especially Prime Minister Modi, pays a lot of importance to delivering messages to the common masses because he has this kind of fundamental connect. I think what this budget should have done, the third quarter GDP numbers will come, and I don't think they'll be as rosy as what a lot of people expect them to be. I think there has to be a recognition of the fact that the Indian economy is in a slowdown. We have had this bravado for quite some time. I think there's no because if your economy is in a slowdown, no matter what you pretend, it will catch up with you after some point of time, maybe a year, a couple of years, etc. I think the government should say that yes, we are in a slowdown. A recovery will happen. This need not be a statistical recovery. The government will, like Sukumar said, throw the kitchen sink at it, do whatever it can to ensure that there's a proper recovery. This, I think, will be the biggest thing which will take care of the market sentiment. Because today, even if people have money, they're extremely scared to spend it. What if I lose my job tomorrow? What if my business is not doing well tomorrow? That has to be the biggest thing. And then a set of policies have to follow. That if we agree that we have a problem, now let us agree that we have a solution. What should be the solution? Maybe because the entire budget session will debate the parliament. No, I would rather have the parliament depending on what is the economy than a lot of social political unrest which is going on in the country right now. That discussion can only happen if the government is honest enough to acknowledge that we have a problem at our hands. And then I think, in the best of democratic traditions in India, something will emerge. Because, it is not that we have become a banana republic. Our economy is still growing. So technically, we are not in a recession. The point is not whether we'll come back from this 5.7% 4% growth to 6.5% growth next year. The point is, how soon can we target an 8% growth, a 9% growth? Until there, 3-4 years ago, we also used to talk about a double-digit growth. I think the government has to set its sight long-term on putting the economy back in its original trajectory and try and build a political democratic consensus towards
I have the same question for you, but with an additional caveat. Do you think, as Roshan is saying, the government is still in denial, or do you think the government implicitly acknowledges that there is a problem?
I think there is both implicit and explicit acknowledgement. I think for some time there was denial, yes, but I think especially if you look at the variety of measures that they've announced throughout in the last quarter of last calendar year, September, November, October, November, December, there were a slew of measures that were announced, and then clearly these measures are not being announced because they think everything is all right, and so there is explicit as well as implicit assumption that things are not good. I mean, it might not be as confessional a statement as Roshan wants, but there is an explicit assumption. I mean, they know, and I don't think no one is trying to hide the fact that you're in a slowdown. You can't. The numbers sort of speak for themselves. So that much is done, but the problem is, you are a $2.7 trillion economy. You are a complex economy. I've often said this. India is a country which is living in many different time zones all at once, right? And many different centuries all at once. So it's very difficult to arrive at policies that is going to solve everything. You need really smart policies in 5 or 6 places. And I think the important thing is to pick policies which will have the maximum impact. So with that in mind, I'm going to suggest 3 things which I think will help in the short term, right? I mean, because I think it's very important to get that short term thing up. The first one is a bad bank. I've been saying this for a long time. I know there are lots of people who think a bad bank is a bad idea. I'm not convinced that it is a bad idea. I think it will, in one swoop, help clean up a lot of things. It will help you compartmentalize the problem. It will help you sequester the problem. And there is...
So it becomes home to all the bad loans.
Yeah, the double balance sheet problem is very real, right? And you're addressing a significant problem, part of that by doing this. The second one is money for infrastructure. I would recommend a good domestic infra bond, which can actually tap local money. Why should investor money go just into the stock market? Just like they can buy part of LIC and LIC can put the money somewhere else, you can do this. The third one is 2 parts to it. You have to do things for the urban consumer. You have to do things for the rural consumer. For rural consumer, I would agree with Himanshu. You need a package. Let us not forget that in 2008-9, it was Bharat that kept India afloat when the crisis hit. And that recovery was V-shaped because you had that underlying resilience and strength. That underlying resilience and strength has been significantly damaged. So you need to get that back. You need that. Urban, as much as it favors the rich, I would recommend a very strong and radical rationalization of income tax.
In addition to what has happened today?
For the simple reason that last year when the budget was announced, we took 2 steps backward. What we've done now is taken 1 step forward. Countries around the world don't, I mean, as much as there is now a move towards increasing taxes to Scandinavian levels, I think people will be willing to put up with it if the service delivery is also of Scandinavian levels. I don't think countries move ahead, progress by actually increasing income tax. We should actually be decreasing. And to have a peak rate of 42.7% at the highest level is not on. I think we just need to, I know very few people pay tax, but the impact it will have on sentiment is very, very significant. As you can judge from all the angry articles that the rich investment bankers wrote soon after last year, this was increased to 42.7%. And especially on social media, you had this outrage from people saying, we can work anywhere in the world. Why do we have to be here? Because this is a very, very mobile target group that you're speaking of. So you should make them feel good. So these are probably three things which I think would have immediate impact.
I think we can end on the note that we all hope that you will increase our salary so that we become eligible for that tax slab at one point. But that brings us to the end of this special discussion on the budget. Incremental steps have been taken to address the slowdown, but is it enough? The panel doesn't think that measures are probably adequate to tackle the slowdown. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much to Sukumar sir, Roshan and Himanshu ji for this insightful discussion.